We have 21 participants.
Okay, we're muting everyone. I mean to be rude. Okay, let us begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bet Torah Pesach Crash Course Part 1. So my part will be, you give us 22 minutes or around there, and I'll give you the Haggadah. So let me tell you what the objective of this class will be, what I'll be using to try to fulfill that objective, a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll begin. So this is not a comprehensive textual understanding class of the Haggadah. That would take hours. In other words, we're not going to be sharing specific insights and commentaries about certain paragraphs, phrases, sayings, and ideas in the Haggadah. The purpose of this class is going to be a general overview of the Haggadah, so that we all understand after, as best possible, after I finish, the pages of the Haggadah are serving what purpose, and you have a good understanding of the context of this book, why it was presented the way it's presented, and just have an outline of how these pages are all functioning. So we're going to be using two different documents that I prepared for you. One is 4 pages. It's just a basic source review. And the other is an actual Haggadah. We'll be using the famous Shalom Yerushalayim Haggadah. Sometimes you can see this in blue. I'm sure many, if not most, all of you have seen this before, have it in your houses. It's the English Hebrew. So I actually have that in a document that we'll be using, and I'll be switching back and forth between the Haggadah, actual Haggadah text, and some short source sheets that we'll be using. Part of my objective will be to explain to you that even though in this book, there's approximately 16 pages, which we will call Mageed, we will fulfill the actual mitzvah from the Torah of conveying and talking about the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim from Kehalah Ma'anya until the Beracha at the end. Although that's the case, 5 of those 16 pages approximately are going to be strictly introductory. And what you'll see is that some of the paragraphs that we spend a lot of time discussing, or our kids bring home sheets from their teachers in school, be it elementary or high school, on those sections are really just introductory parts. They're important, but they're not the meat of the Haggadah. That's part of what I'm trying to get across to you tonight. Okay, one introductory comment, and then I'll get on the documents that we'll be using, and we'll look at them together. The introductory comment is the following. The function of the Haggadah can be summarized in one simple word: education. The function of the Haggadah is to educate and remind ourselves, and educate and remind those around us about what the Torah wants us to convey, understand, comprehend, and delve into that night. Education. Within education, there are a number of undercurrents and overriding themes within Mageed, within the Haggadah. One of them is faith, the idea that the Exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, demonstrated the existence of God. It's where God introduced himself to the world, demonstrated God's infinite power over the world, his dominion over nature, his ability to intervene, to manipulate nature and sometimes even peoples at his will. So that's all about faith. The second word, 3 words. Second word is chosenness, reminding ourselves how fortunate we are to be the single chosen nation carrying out God's word. That finds itself throughout the pages of the Haggadah. And finally, appreciation, reflecting upon what God has done for us then and now, and having that inspire us and be the impetus for us to appreciate and give gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Function, education, main themes, faith, chosenness, appreciation. That said, let's get going. So first, I'm going to share with you a document that I created that is, in essence, source pages to give you the background and structure of the Haggadah. Okay, Jack, can they still see me? Okay, great. Okay, so this is a four-page document. Jack, if you can please mute whoever that is. Okay, this is a four-page document. It starts with going over the Haggadah Guidelines. Who created Haggadah Guidelines? Of course, Chachamim did. And I wrote on top how Chachamim instructed us to structure the Haggadah. In other words, what ingredients goes into this text, to this book, that Chachamim wanted to use those ingredients to form the basis of the Haggadah. Very simple. There's a Mishnah, Masechet Pesachim, that gives us a few basic instructions, and then one comment from the Gemara. And then I'll show you how those play out. So the first instruction the Mishnah tells us is Mathil Bignut Umsayem B'Shevach. I wrote there in the red. Basically, that asks the authors of the Haggadah and those who recite the Haggadah, us, to begin telling the story of the Jewish people and the exodus of Egypt at a low point, disgraceful point in our history, and conclude at a high point that facilitates our impetus to praise God. How do we accomplish that? We'll speak about that in a moment. The second point of instruction in the Mishnah says, V'doresh me'arami oved avi. The way I want you to be able to discuss and convey the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is by analyzing a paragraph in the Torah called Arami Oved Avi until the end of the paragraph. Instruction 3, you're familiar with, it's the line in the Haggadah. Rabban Gamliel says, whoever doesn't mention and speak of the following three concepts does not fulfill his mitzvah: Pesach, Korban Pesach, Masa, and Maror. We're familiar with that. Let's go back to instruction number 1. Instruction number 1, the Mishnah directs us to begin at a low point, a disgraceful point in our history. The Gemara asks, here I am down here in Masechet Pesachim, commenting on that Mishnah, my Ginut. What would be considered? How does that play out? What low point is the Mishnah referring to? My Bignut. It's a argument between Rav and Shmuel, the two famous first generation Amoraim, student of Rav. Rav is a student of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the author of the composer of the Mishnah. Rav says, you know what a low or disgraceful point means? I'm pointing there to Rav says, we were idolaters to begin with. Where does that come from? I'll show you in a moment. And Shmuel says, no, I disagree. This refers to Avadim Hayinu b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves in Egypt. So there's a fundamental argument here with where Chachamim want us to start in the history of the Jewish people. Now, Rav actually is taking a line from a famous speech. It's a famous speech from Yehoshua ben Nun. I'm going to scroll down to that speech for you. Here it is. Yehoshua ben Nun, the student of Moshe Rabbeinu, as you know, brought Am Yisrael into the state, into Eretz Yisrael. And at the end of that book, the 24th chapter, towards the end of his life, Yehoshua ben Nun gave a speech to the presence of much of the entire nation. And that the essence of that speech was basically a history lesson. It says here, Kesuk Pasuk Aleph, that he gathered all of the tribes, the leaders, and they stood before Yehoshua and before God, the Mishkan. And Yehoshua told the nation, and I'm pointing to the Hebrew, but I'll paraphrase in English for you. God, thus says God, there was a time that our forefathers on the other side of the river, Terah was the father of Abraham and Nahor. They were idolaters. The entire world was paganistic. There were no Jewish people. There were no chosen people as of yet. In fact, the world was doing their best to disqualify themselves from being chosen. And Yeshua ben Nun reminded them in Pasuk Gimel, I chose Abraham Avinu, and he merited the land of Canaan, and he eventually had Yitzhak, and then Yitzhak had Yaakov, etc. This speech goes on from Yeshua ben Nun's standpoint to basically remind them of their entire history from that point on. They went down to Egypt, they were slaves, they were freed, there were miracles, they went through the desert, etc. Yeshua ben Nun's objective in this speech basically was to let the nation go, let the nation know, listen, guys, you did not always have and merit this life of prosperity, comfort, and security. It wasn't always that way. You started a long time ago with no identity. You were from a world of pagans. Eventually, God chose you. Eventually, God redeemed you. And eventually, you made your way to this land. And everything you see around you started from humble beginnings. That speech and that idea, says Shemuel, let's get back, says Rav rather, is where we should start telling the story from a text that tells us about the early parts pre-Judaism of our history, where we were simply mixed with the rest of the pagans of the world. Good. And Shemuel starts no. So Shemuel says we should begin by telling the actual story from the exodus of Egypt and skip the rest. Okay. It happens to be that we fulfill both commands, both directives in the Haggadah, and we'll demonstrate how. Okay. Now I want to go back to this second directive. Second directive says, the way I want you to structure your story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is I want you to analyze a paragraph of the Torah. What paragraph is that? I'm going to scroll down to something that we call the Bikurim proclamation. All the way at the end of the Torah, in Parashat Kitabo, in the book of Devarim, there is a mitzvah that someone who lives in the land of Israel and has first fruits and produce, before he can partake in them, he has to bring a certain amount of them, trek up to Yerushalayim, go to the Bet HaMikdash, and present his first produce to the Kohen, and proclaim a certain proclamation. Here you can see the first Pesukim you'll recognize from the beginning of Parashat Kitabo says that I bring you to the land, you'll take from your first fruits, you'll come to the Kohen, he'll take the basket of fruits from you, Va'anita, I'm pointing to Pasuk He, and you will proclaim the following. And you'll recognize these Pesukim. What is the proclamation of he who brings the Bikurim, his first fruits, to the Kohen, the Bet HaMikdash? The proclamation basically is a historical one. My father, probably referring to Yaakov Abinu, went down in small numbers to Egypt. They did evil to us. They oppressed us. Zion, we called out to God. He saw our affliction and oppression. He took us out of Egypt with great power, mightiness, and supernatural actions, and he brought us to Israel. What the authors, Hachamim told the authors of the Haggadah to do is as follows. They said, listen, this is a great history. It's only 1, 2, 3, 4 Pesukim. But this proclamation of he who brings first fruits is a fantastic history of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So you know what? I want you to take these 4 Pesukim all the way in the book of Devarim. I want you to use these 4 Pesukim as the foundation, as the framework for telling the entire story. Now, I want to just reflect back to what I told you is one of the 3 major overriding themes of the night in the Haggadah, and that is appreciation. Yeshua ben Nun was trying to impart that upon the people in his speech. Appreciate where you started, where you came from, and where you are now. Contrast always helps facilitate appreciation. Indeed, this proclamation, he who brings first fruits, is doing the very same thing, where that person who is wealthy and God has blessed them with prosperity is forced to proclaim and be conscious of and remind himself of his humble beginnings. This is where we started. Yaakov, Egypt, servitude, suffering, and finally redemption. That's why they chose this speech, and also because it's succinct and it's a compact summary of the story. They said as follows. They said doresh. What does doresh mean? Analyze, derive. And that means when you quote one of these pisukim, take every few words, every phrase, analyze it, reflect back to the actual incident, which is from the parashiot in the Torah of Shemot, Ba'era, Bo, for the most part, Beshalah, and expand upon the story. This is the foundation and framework of our Haggadah. So let's go back to these instructions again, and then we'll start looking at the Haggadah. First of all, start at a low point, end at a high point. There's two different opinions, which will show you we do both of them. Use the paragraph of Arami Oved Avi to analyze. And finally, the Rabban Gamliel's statement, which we'll see will be quoted, as you know, at the end of the Haggadah. Okay, so let's go to the actual text of the Haggadah. There it is. And here we go. Kalach Ma'anya is a much later historical edition. We won't get into it. It's for invitation purposes solely. The Manishtana was one of those instructions in the Mishnah, which I didn't quote for you, but Hachamim wanted us to start with questions because, as I said, the function of the Haggadah is education. Education starts with curiosity, starts with questions, starts with getting people involved. And by the way, you will see in this Manishtana, there's contrast as well. There's bitterness and redemption. There is wealth and prosperity versus oppression in these four questions. Contrast inspires appreciation and gratitude. So that's the function of Manishtana. Now, I told you the first 5 pages are introductory, and here's the way I'm going to show it to you. So here's our pasuk. We start, this is the official start, Avadim Hayinu Lefar'al b'Mitzrayim. It's actually a quote from a pasuk in the Torah from the Hacham son, as we'll see. And what does this paragraph do for us of Avadim? Well, it has 3 functions. Function number 1, it's one of the opinions as to how to start the story from a low point. We were slaves in Egypt. Function number 2, the first line provides us with contrast and inspires appreciation. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves. Vayosienu, God took us out. But you'll see in this paragraph, in the following few paragraphs, we have regarding the mitzvah of telling the story, the what, the who, the how much, and the when. The what is in this first paragraph. What do you have to do? Well, tell the story. Who? Even where all Hachamim Nevonim were educated, we still have to tell the story. How much? Well, the story, you have the famous incident of the 5 rabbis sitting around the table. They had to be reminded that it was already dawn of the next day. How much? Unlimited. The when, you have Rabbi Azar ben Azariah and his famous discussion with Hachamim, talking about, do you say the story at night or in the day? That will be continued a little later here about the date. Should you do it from Rosh Chodesh? How long should you wait? So that's the when. What's left of our introduction? Well, here you have a famous page that has what we call the 4 sons. The 4 sons are actually, as I'll show you right now, 4 sources. So I'm going back to the only page we didn't look at in our source sheet. And that is this page. What are the 4 sons? The 4 sons are 4 sources in the Torah where the Torah asks us to respond to questions. As you can see, there's one source from Devarim, and the other 3 are from Shemot, all really from Parashat Bo in Shemot. And all of them but one, the Torah says, when your son will ask you, respond as follows. Meaning, please educate your children and the rest of your surrounding people and colleagues about the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It happens to be that each of these requests, so to speak, in the Torah, these sources of telling the story were packaged and framed in different ways. So Hachamim, to give a little label to them and help us understand and remember, gave us the famous 4 sons, the type of people based on the way these questions are answered. We're not going to go into them now, but you know who they are. The Hacham is based on the way this question from the book of Devarim, Parashat Vayetchanan, is asked. This is actually a very long answer, and you can see that it's a 5 pasuk answer that we give the person who frames the question in that manner. You could also see that in the first pasuk, Kaf Aleph, is where the Avadim Hayinu L'Farao B'Misraim, that pasuk comes from. The Rasha is a question. It's a shorter answer. The Tam, a very short question and a short answer. And of course, the fourth one didn't start with a question. Ironically, however, this is the real, legitimate, authentic source out of all these four Pesukim, the directive that you must tell the story, the one who, so to speak, can't ask. So there's a directive. You must convey to your children and to others the story on this day. So going back to the other screen now, what we just learned is that the four sons are really the four sources from the Torah of the obligation to tell the story. So we're still in our introduction. We had the what, the who, the how much, and the when of this mitzvah. We had the four sources of this mitzvah. And look what we have next, ladies and gentlemen. Wouldn't you know it? We have the other method of starting from a low point. We say that we were, as Rav's opinion said in the Gemara, in the beginning we were idolaters. And look here, Vayomer Yehoshua, guess whose speech we quote? Part of Yehoshua ben Nun's speech to the people, the part that is relevant to our story. Now, this paragraph accomplishes three things. A, it is fulfilling the other opinion of starting at a low point. B, you have contrast in here, which again facilitates appreciation. In the beginning, we were idolaters, and then Kerevaru Hamakom, God brought us to his service. And finally, this sort of plugs the gap of the history that we don't get. If you start from the story of Egypt, you don't get the early part of our history, which is Abraham, Abinu, Yitzhak, Yaakov, etc. That's included in this speech. So that is the purpose, the objective of this paragraph, and that almost rounds out our introduction. The final part of our introduction is that once you mention Abraham Abinu and God's choosing of him, it behooves us to then talk about the fact that God's communication to Abraham, this haftaha, what is the basis of our meriting being the chosen people, and not only being exiled from Egypt, but always being in our redeemed from Egypt, the exile of Egypt, but always in our long, difficult exile, being preserved and guarded by God. And we make a toast, V'hisha Amda, that promise that gave us survival. When we reach this point, our introduction is over. It's a long 5-page introduction, but it's important to know that it was just that. The meat of our Haggadah only begins with Se'ulmad. This paragraph and the following, most of the pages which follow here on the Haggadah, are basically following the instructions that Hachamim gave us, namely, quote the proclamation of the person who brought the first fruits, the Bikurim, and analyze that paragraph. And you can see what happens here, starting from, you can see in this third line of this paragraph, Arami Oved Avi. We quote the pasuk. We then take a few words from from that pasuk, Vayered Misraima, and we analyze those words. How do we do so? By reflecting back to Pesukim from the actual episode of the Exodus of Egypt. And so these words, Vayered Misraima, Bimte Me'ad, Vayhisham, are simply from that first pasuk. Remember, there's only 4 Pesukim from the Bikurim proclamation that we're analyzing. So we break down each pasuk into subparts. We quote from other sources to help expand upon the story, from the sources of where the events actually took place in history. And then what do? We finish and we quote another pasuk. Vayare'u otanu hamisrim is pasuk number 2 from the Bikurim proclamation, and so forth. We take every few words from that pasuk, we analyze it, and we do it by quoting Pesukim from the original events in Parashat Shemot, Va'era bo Beshalah, and so on and so forth. So you can see as I'm scrolling down, these are simply the 4 Pesukim of the Bikurim proclamation that we analyze. And that takes us through the meat of the Haggadah. So if I were to make a suggestion to you as to how to prepare for the Haggadah and how much time to spend on which parts of the Haggadah, I would really suggest that these pages, analyzing those 4 Pesukim, get the most of our focus and discussion, because that was the instructions of Hachamim. And as I scroll down, it goes really all the way to Biyad Hazakah, Otot. All the way to Otot is the 4 analysis of those 4 Pesukim of the Bikurim proclamation. That's the meat of our Haggadah. Once we said Be'otot, we named the Esed Makot. We have a few paragraphs of discussion on the Esed Makot. And then after that, we sing a nice song of praise to Hashem, which is one of the themes of the night. And we go to the Rabban Gamliel's instruction, which is one of the directives of the Mishnah, to say Pesach, Masa, Umaror. Ladies and gentlemen, that really rounds up your Haggadah. We have a famous line that every generation, a person, every Jew must look at himself as if he left Egypt. And then finally, we had the 2 paragraphs of Hallel, and we finished the Haggadah. So I'm going to come back to look at all of you and just summarize this all so I can pass the baton to Rabbi Tobias. What we saw here is that our Haggadah is really a very short document, and the text includes, depending on your Haggadah, a number of pages, of which a third of those are introductions to the Mizvah. The what, how much, when, who of the Mizvah, who's obligated, when are we obligated, how much are we obligated to discuss and analyze this story, followed by the 4 sources, which is the 4 sons. And in that introduction, we fulfill the directive of Hachamim to start at a low point in our history, both of the opinions, the low point of Avraham Avinu time, post-pagan, pagan observance, so to speak, and the other one starting in Yetziat Mitzrayim. We saw a contrast in a lot of these paragraphs that help us appreciate and acknowledge what God has done for us, where we come from, and where God has brought us to. And then finally, the meat of the Haggadah, the crux of it, was Hachamim's directive to analyze the 4 pasuk proclamation of the person who brings Bikurim, who also himself has to appreciate his history. We analyze each of those 4 Pesukim by breaking them into sub-Pesukim and quoting other Pesukim from the actual events. And we round out with Rabban Gamliel's directive of mentioning Pesach Masa Maror. That is the Haggadah in a nutshell. I gave you a little more than 22 minutes, maybe 27. I try to give you the Haggadah as best I can. I'll sign off now. I hope you appreciated that. I wish you all a Hak Hashem v'Sameach Tzkulishim Rabod Amor v'Tobot, and I'll pass the baton to Rabbi Tobias. Enjoy. Jack, it's all yours.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Jack, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Why can't I see this? Hold on 1 second. Okay, great. All right, so good evening, everybody. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll try to do the best we can to touch on the highlights. We're going to move to Halachana. I know Rabbi Matalon was talking about the Haggadah. This year presents a very interesting situation because Erev Pesach falls out on Saturday. Leil HaSeder, the first Seder, is going to be Saturday night, which means Erev Pesach is on Saturday, which precludes or changes and adjusts a lot of the things that we're used to doing. I'm going to try and take it in chronological order so that we can move in an organized fashion. Usually what happens is that the night before Leil HaSeder, we do B'dikat Hametz, which technically would be Friday night. However, we cannot do B'dikat Hametz on Friday night for obvious reasons. We also cannot burn the Hametz on Erev Pesach because it's Shabbat. And so things are going to change. So again, I'm going to try and take it in chronological order to try and explain what the Seder is. And if there's any questions, and we have time, maybe we'll take some at the end. I'm going to begin with Sioux Birhot. We have a minhag, we have a custom that always on Erev Pesach, the firstborn boy fasts. We cannot do that on Erev Pesach this year because, again, we do not fast on Saturday. We also do not fast on Friday. So we're going to back up Sioux Birhot or Ta'anit Bechorot to Thursday. So any firstborn boy that is fasting is going to be doing so on Thursday. However, because it's pushed up, there are some flexibilities. As an example, if you are a father who has a firstborn boy who's very young and you go to shul and you participate in the siyum on his behalf, this year there would be the flexibility and you would not need to do so because of the fact that it's not on the actual day of the ta'anit. Otherwise, the minhag stays in place and we do fast on Thursday before this coming Thursday, or we are participating in a siyum. We go to shul, we hear the siyum, we participate in the meal, and that takes us out of the fast. So for those of you who are firstborn men or have a child, that is in terms of siyum bechorot. Thursday evening, we're going to do bedikat hametz, which again is 2 nights before Leil HaSeder. Bedikat hametz should be done beginning, meaning not earlier than 7:35, which is approximately 20 minutes after sunset, is the time that you can begin doing your bedikat hametz. We do it as usual. So beracha beforehand, the beracha is al bi'ur hametz, on the getting rid of, on the burning of hametz, not al bedikat hametz, al bi'ur hametz. You do your regular searching. After bedikat hametz is over, you do the regular kal hamira. I do want to make 2 points on bedikat hametz that are true for every year, but it's an opportunity to mention it. One is, customarily, we use a candle. However, a flashlight is also permissible, and I want to say probably even recommended, particularly because if you are going to be afraid to check into hard to reach places because you're holding a candle and you're worried that it's dangerous, in which case you're essentially not fulfilling the mission of bedikat hametz because you're not checking under the bed, you're not checking behind the armoire, you're not checking in the drawers, then certainly a flashlight would be recommended so that you can do the bidikah as it was meant to be, which is to check in all the places that you would not have necessarily cleaned over the course of the last couple of weeks. That's one. 2 is, and my students always are surprised when I say this, bedikat hametz does not have to be with the lights off. It's not a surprise party. I wouldn't say, oh, I lost my earrings, let me turn the lights off and look for it. Bedikat hametz can and should be done with the lights on. The flashlight, again, or the candle is to help to do the hard to reach places, under the bed, behind the server, and those places. So bedikat hametz is done with a candle or a flashlight. It is done on Thursday night with the regular beracha, followed by the kal hamira, which is written in Aramaic. If you do not understand the Aramaic, it should be said in the language that you understand, which could be either Hebrew or English, or whatever other language is understood. That is to say the kal hamira. That's Thursday. So morning is the siyum ta'anit, and Thursday night is bedikat hametz. Friday, although it is not Erev Pesach, we are still going to burn the hametz. And the reason for that is because we want to keep the seder in order, meaning on a regular day, we would follow the bedikat hametz with the burning of the hametz, and we want to keep that seder, that organization the way it is. So we burn the hametz on Friday afternoon, and the time to burn it by is 11:20. And we also sell the hametz on Friday. Now, that being said, we are still eating hametz into Shabbat. So you're going to burn, but you're also going to leave over bread for your Shabbat meals, which is where things get tricky, which we'll discuss. A couple of pitot or challah, you're going to leave over for your Shabbat meals. But Friday, again, we're going to burn by 11:20. You're going to sell your hametz on Friday. You'll do it with the shul. And then Friday night and Shabbat, we talk about a Shabbat meal. So there are a couple of different options in terms of approaching the Shabbat meals, both on Friday night and Shabbat morning. I'm going to call them options 1, option 2, and option 3. Option 1 will label the full bread option, okay? And I'm going to suggest, even though this option will include having bread by both meals, that the Shabbat meal be a kosher for Passover meal, cooked in kosher for Passover pots, to maintain how much chametz you are having. So you can have a kosher for Passover meal made in kosher for Passover pots, but you're going to be having bread. So Friday night, you're going to say hamotzi, and you're going to have bread, challah, pita, however you usually do, and obviously keep it as contained as possible so you don't make a mess and have crumbs everywhere, but you'll wash and you'll say hamotzi on bread. Shabbat morning, assuming you are going to pray early, you would also have a bread meal for Seudat Shabbat on Shabbat. You have to stop eating hametz by 10 a.m., which would mean you would go to early minyan, you would get home, you would say hamotzi on kiddush and hamotzi on bread, finish eating by 10:10, and then we're going to discard of all the bread, which I'll talk about in a moment. You're not necessarily having a meat meal at 9:30 in the morning. You can have a bagel and cream cheese. That will be your Seudat Shabbat. They'll say hamotzi, you'll make kiddush, and you fulfilled your obligation for the Seudah, the second Seudah of Shabbat, and lunch, which you might have later, which is a kosher for Passover meal, which you might have later in the day, could technically be Seudah Shalishit, depending on when you eat it, but that would be without bread. You're fulfilling your obligation to have your second Seudah with bread by 10:10 in the morning, having gone to early minyan. And then you're going to get rid of the bread, which again, I'll talk about when I finish with all of the options. That is option number one. Option number two is half bread, half not bread, which would mean Friday night you're having bread. By the way, I forgot to mention, and I want to say it, when you burn the bread on Friday, you are not saying the Kal Hamira. Again, I'll repeat that. When you burn the bread on Friday, you're not going to do the Kal Hamira, which is usually done right after you burn it, and that's because we're continuing to eat bread. Option two, for Shabbat meals, Friday night you'll have bread as regular, as we mentioned, challah or pita, you'll give it out in a maintained fashion. Shabbat morning, you would not be going to regular minyan. You would not be going to early minyan. You'll go to regular minyan, whatever that is. Let's say 8:30. You're getting home 10:30, 11 o'clock. The time for eating hametz has already passed, so we cannot have bread. What the options you have are the following. You could have egg matzah. Okay, you cannot have regular matzah on Erev Pesach. And the reason for that is we want to enter into Leil HaSeder with an appetite, so to speak, for matzah, having it be the first time in a year that we're eating matzah. So I can have my Shabbat, my kosher for Passover meal with egg matzah. I'm not going to say hamotzi. I'm going to say mizonot on egg matzah. It's matzah ashira. And I will conduct my regular Shabbat meal, having egg matzah in place of my bread and eating my regular meal. As an alternate to that, I can have fried matzah. Chacham Ovadia brings down, I can have fried matzah, which would mean Friday before Shabbat starts, I'm going to fry the matzah in oil, which then makes it matzah ashira. However, in that case, I would say hamotzi on the matzah. So if I want to say hamotzi, I would not be able to do this on egg matzah. I would make fried matzah from Friday, and I would use that on Shabbat morning. Since it was fried, it stays it does no longer qualifies as regular matzah, and therefore I don't have the issue of ruining my appetite for matzah that night, but it retains its hamotzi status. In that case, again, I'm eating after 10:10. I must discard of whatever leftover bread I have on Shabbat morning by 11:20 a.m. So whatever bread I have left over from Friday night, and whatever bread I have left over, if I had bread early on Shabbat morning, I have to discard of by 11:20 on Shabbat day, and that would be done, either by flushing it down the toilet. I would break it up into crumbs, flush it down the toilet. If you're not comfortable with that, discard of it in a garbage that's outside, rendering it not edible anymore. And you have discarded the hametz. And at that point, you will say the second kal hamira, which you did not say on Friday when you burned it. So option number one is bread Friday night, bread Shabbat morning, assuming I'm eating before 10:10. Option number two is bread Friday night, and then either egg matzah, which is mizonot, or fried matzah, which is hamotzi, Shabbat morning after 10:10, eaten with my meal. In both cases, I'm discarding of any hametz that I have left over by 11:20 Shabbat morning. Option three is the full-fledged matzah option. And that would be that I can have matzah, regular matzah, that I have at Leil HaSeder on Friday night, because it's not the day of Erev Pesach, so I'm allowed to have regular matzah. I would wash and say hamotzi on the matzah, because I've rendered my bread inedible, so this is now my bread. I would say hamotzi on regular matzah Friday night. And then Shabbat morning, I don't have bread anymore, so I'm assuming I'm eating after 10:10, and I would go either with the egg matzah or the fried matzah option for my Shabbat afternoon meal. If you're doing option three, then you would say kal hamira when you burn your hametz on Friday, because at that point you are saying, I am done with hametz, I'm getting rid of it, I'm finished, I'm nullifying it, I'm tucking it away, and I'm entering into matzah only meals. So I'm going to just quickly review the three options. Option one, bread Friday night, bread Shabbat morning before 10:10, and disposing of it by 11:20. Option two, bread Friday night, egg matzah or fried matzah Shabbat afternoon, assuming I'm eating after 10:10. I'm still discarding of my chametz by 11:20. Option three is the full matzah option, regular matzah Friday night, and I can wash and say hamotzi, and then either egg matzah or fried matzah Shabbat morning. I'm discarding of my chametz by 11:20 with that option as well, but I will have said the kal chamira when I burn the chametz on Friday, because I got rid of it. So those are my options in terms of my Shabbat meals for Friday night and Shabbat morning. All right, Morris, I need another minute, and then I will pass it over. Just a couple of other suggestions. Seudah Shalishit on Shabbat day is going to be a light Seudah Shalishit. We want to make sure you have an appetite for Leil HaSeder, but I do have to have Seudah Shalishit, which will either be the lunch that you have later in the day if I had bread in the morning, or in most cases, it's probably just going to be served in shul. If you're going to regular mincha, it's going to be fruits and vegetables and nuts, very light, just to eat something. We'll rely on the opinions that say that you could fulfill your obligation to Seudah Shalishit in that fashion, and this way you have an appetite going into Leil HaSeder. Saturday night, women cannot prepare the Shabbat, the Leil HaSeder table before 7:35. So 7:35 would be the earliest time that you can start setting the table for Leil HaSeder, because of the fact that we are not allowed to prepare from Shabbat to holiday. So before 7:35 is still considered Shabbat day. Once I hit 7:35, which is 20 minutes after sunset, I've now technically entered into the next day, and I can set up my Seder table starting at 7:35 on Saturday night. In terms of candle lighting on Saturday night, candle lighting should be done after 7:55, which is 40 minutes after Shabbat is over. Shabbat is over at 7:15. We cannot light a candle on Shabbat, and therefore I have to wait 40 minutes. Setting up the table is a derabanan, so it's a little bit more flexible, but lighting a candle for Yom Tov, not before 7:55. I'm saying lahadlik ner shel Yom Tov, and you should not, women should, well, they should say lehavdil ben kodesh lekodesh before lighting the candles, and they should not say shehecheyanu when lighting the candles. You should rely on the shehecheyanu that is going to be said in Kiddush and have in mind that it goes on the candles and all of the other new things that are happening on the holiday. And I'll just end, and then I'll pass it over to Morris for some minhagim of Leil HaSeder. Saturday night in the Kiddush, we are doing what we call Yak Nehaz. We are doing Havdalah in the Kiddush. Yak Nehaz stands for Yain, so you're going to say Hagefen. Then Kof is the Kiddush. You're going to make the Beracha for Kiddush Asher Bachar Banu Kol Amim. And then you're going to do Ner. So you're going to say the Beracha of Borei Meorei Ha'esh. You may not use electricity for that beracha, and that applies always. Havdalah can never be made on electricity. Havdalah has to be done on esh mamash, on actual flame. So you'll use the 24-hour candle that you have lit, so you can light the candles the next night. You'll use that for the beracha of Borei Meorei Ha'esh. Then you're going to make the beracha of Havdalah, Hamavdil ben Kodesh to Kodesh, and then you're going to say Shechiyanu. So it's a unique Kiddush on the first night of Leil HaSeder because we're ending Shabbat and moving into the holiday. So pay attention to the Machzor. Again, I wish everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. I hope that clarified some of the halachot on an interesting year. And I will pass the baton to Chacham Moshe Arking to discuss some of the minhagim of Leil HaSeder.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Morris, thank you.
Okay. All right, very good. Okay, so we'll continue like where Rabbi Tobias left off with the Yak Nehaz, the Yayin Kiddush, Ner Havdalah Zeman, right? You have the special Kiddush that you're saying. What happens if you forget to do Yak Nehaz? What if you just do a regular Kiddush like you do on an ordinary weeknight Yom Tov? You forgot about the candle and the Havdalah. So Haggadah Yosef says that if you remember after Kiddush, before you started with Karpas, it's best to make the Havdalah before Karpas. So you pour a second cup of wine, you hold the wine while you make Borei Meorei Ha'esh on the candle, continue with Hamavdil ben Kodesh the Kodesh, and drink the wine. If you remember any time before you started Mageed, you could do that. You don't say Hagefen again. You already said Hagefen in Kiddush. You just hold the wine while you make Ha'esh and Hamavdil ben Kodesh HaKodesh. Now, if you started Mageed already, Haggadah Yosef says, do the Esh by itself. Make Meorei Ha'esh, Borei Meorei Ha'esh, because you're going to read the Haggadah to the light of fire, and then you can make Havdalah on the second cup, right? You say, Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael. Don't drink yet. Say the Havdalah, Hamavdil ben Kodesh HaKodesh, and then drink the wine. It could be said before the meal. It could be said on the third cup. It could be said on the fourth cup. In other words, you have to say it that night, even if you didn't say it at the onset of the meal in Kiddush. And even after you finish the fourth cup, you can still say it before dawn. If you're going to be saying it after the fourth cup, so you have to recite Borei Pri HaGefen. If you're doing it during the Haggadah, you don't make a special Borei Pri HaGefen for the Havdalah cup. You make Borei Pri HaGefen, Borei Meorei Ha'esh, Hamavdil ben Kodesh HaKodesh, and you drink the wine. One other point on this special Havdalah, Kiddush Havdalah, is if you accidentally said Hamavdil ben Kodesh the whole, like you're accustomed to throughout the year, you fulfilled your obligation, you don't have to go back and repeat it. It's considered sufficient b'di'avad if you said it already. So a few more things just to know about Kaddish, right? We're going to try to get through as much of the Haggadah as possible in the time that's allotted. So things to know about Kaddish. The minimum size of a cup of wine, the cup must be at least 3 ounces. Now, if you're using a cup that's 3 ounces or anything less than 6 ounces, so then to begin with, if you could, for each one of the 4 cups, you should drink the entire cup. But if you would find that difficult, you fulfill your obligation by drinking the majority of the cup. So you don't have to finish the cup if you have a difficulty with drinking wine. If you're having a larger cup, let's say your cup is 6 ounces or more, so then to begin with, you fulfill your obligation by drinking the majority of the cup. But if you couldn't drink the majority of the cup, in the case where it's such a large cup, you fulfill your obligation by drinking at least 3 ounces from the cup. Now, with regards to wine, the Sephardic custom is that red wine it's preferable to white wine. Even if you have an expensive bottle of white wine and not such an expensive bottle of red wine, we prefer the red wine. If you wanted to make your white wine red, you could pour some red wine in it. You could even do that on Yom Tov. And then it would have the halachic status of being preferable. Wine is definitely considered preferable to grape juice, but if somebody is not accustomed to drinking wine, that will make them feel sick. If they drink so much wine, they can fulfill their obligation with grape juice. So wine is choice number one, but grape juice is an acceptable alternative. So now, Kadesh Urhatz. Urhatz is pretty straightforward. You wash your hands as if you were washing for bread. You pour it 3 times on one hand, 3 times on the other hand, without a beracha. If you accidentally said the beracha, so it's fine, but you should try to remember not to say the beracha. And then you get to karpas. So when you recite the beracha for karpas, the rabbis teach that it's preferable to have the maror in mind as well, which is also borei pri ha'adama. In many households, the custom is that the head of the household recites borei pri ha'adama, and everybody says amen. In such a case, the head of the household should be aware of the fact that he's saying it on behalf of everybody, and everybody should have it in mind. That's considered the preferable way to do it if everything works out, meaning it's Birov Am Hadrat Melech, right? It's everybody doing the mitzvah together, just like we do Kiddush and Havdalah all year round. One person recites it, everybody listens. So that's the preferred way to do Karpas. But if the person leading the Haggadah might not know that when he recites it, he's reciting it on behalf of everybody, or he might not know how to recite the beracha properly, in such a case, then in that case, it would be preferable for everyone to say their own beracha. Now with karpas, you're supposed to eat less than 1 ounce of karpas, so as not to put yourself in a situation where some authorities would require you to make borei nefashot on the karpas. So you should have a small piece of celery. But if you had more, right, you weren't thinking about it or you weren't aware of it, and you ate 1 ounce or more of celery, the rule is safek berachot lehakel. Whenever there's a doubt, we don't recite the beracha. So under no circumstances would you actually recite borei nefashot on the celery. The idea of having less than 1 ounce is to avoid that mahloket, that difference of opinion amongst the poskim. So now we get up to yahatz. Yahatz is where you break the middle masa into 1 larger piece and 1 smaller piece. The larger piece becomes the afikomin. The Sephardic custom is just to wrap it and put it under the tablecloth. Our custom, the Middle Eastern custom, is to cut it into a shape of 2 letters. So it's a smaller dalet, right? You cut it so that there's a top piece and a side piece, but that's altogether should be the smaller piece. And then the inner piece which comes out is your vav. The vav is the afikomin, and the Syrian custom is prior to putting it under the tablecloth to hold it in your right hand over your left shoulder to recite the pasuk mish'arotam. Each person gets a turn doing this, and at the conclusion of the pasuk, the people at the table all ask, and it's our custom to ask the questions in Arabic. Where are you coming from? And the person answers, from Egypt. Where are you going to Jerusalem? What are your provisions? What are you carrying? Matzah umaror, right? Even though there's no maror actually in the package that we have, but since the Hakamim taught us that at the time that they left Egypt, this pasuk Mish'arotam was talking about carrying the leftover matzah and maror from the Korban Pesach. So it's as if we are those Jews that left Egypt at that time. So we answer the question according to what they were carrying, not necessarily according to what we're carrying today. So that's Yahatz. And now you get to Mageed. So Mageed, again, we said the principle of Birov Am Hadrat Melech. When everybody does the mitzvah together, it's preferable. And when you hear Kiddush and you don't actually say Kiddush, someone says it for you. This is based again on the principle of Shomea Ke'oneh, right? If somebody is saying something on your behalf, he has you in mind and you have it in mind. So even though you're not saying it, it's as if you are saying it. Shomeya ke'oneh. Oneh here means to be saying it. So the general custom is that the head of the household reads the Haggadah and everybody listens to the head of the household. And it's important, if you're doing it this way, that the person who's reading has everyone else in mind. In many households, they go around the table and they switch off from paragraph to paragraph. Each one gets a turn to read. So if the person who's reading, it's his turn to read, you don't think that he really understands that he's supposed to have everybody in mind. So in such a case, you should read that paragraph on your own, right, in order to fulfill your obligation. But if the person who's reading is proficient in reading and proficient in the laws, he knows that he's reading on your behalf, you can merely fulfill your obligation by listening, right? Women can also read a paragraph, but again, there's a difference of opinion if a woman could read on behalf of a man. Haggadah Yosef says if a woman's reading, it's preferable to read to yourself in order to fulfill your obligation according to all the opinions. But if you didn't read on your own, you fulfill your obligation of reciting the Haggadah by hearing a woman read it on your behalf. The Haggadah Yosef explains that when the pasuk says "V'higata lebincha," the mitzvah is to tell the story to your son. It doesn't mean that you only fulfill the obligation by telling it to your son. If you have a son and your son is present, so he's your primary responsibility, meaning you must tell him the story. But if you don't have a son or your son is not with you, so you could fulfill your obligation of telling the story to any other person. If you have a daughter and she's there, you tell your daughter, you could tell your wife, or any guest, any friend, any relative, anyone that's present, you fulfill your obligation by telling them. If someone was by themselves, like last year, unfortunately, some people were by themselves, they're still obligated to tell the story, and they fulfill their obligation by telling the story on their own to themselves. The primary person that you should be focusing on is a child that's under the age of bar or bat mitzvah, but old enough to hear the story. So therefore, let's say you're a grandfather. So your son, he's married, he's in his 20s, he's in his 30s, but he brings his son, who's 8 or 9 years old. So your primary responsibility on that night is to focus on your grandson, right? Because he's in that age that's considered the optimum way to perform the mitzvah. And when you're reading it and your adult son is hearing you, it's again, Shomea Ka'oneh. It's like if he's telling his son by hearing you tell the story. So that's the general mitzvah of Mageed. Mageed concludes with the beracha of Asher Ge'alanu, Baruch Atah Hashem Gal Yisrael, at which point you drink the second cup. It's most of the important stages of the evening should be preferably completed by midnight, which means halachic midnight, 1:01 a.m., which means preferably you should even have completed the Hallel and drank the fourth cup before midnight. If you didn't, you could still do it after midnight. And Asher Ge'alanu, Gali says, one of those berakot that preferably should be recited prior to halachic midnight. But if it was past 1:01 a.m., you still recite the berakah with Hashem's name. It's not too late to recite it. Now, every time you drink one of the 4 cups of wine, you're obligated to lean to the left. If you forgot to lean to the left, if you're a woman, you don't have to drink the wine again. If you're a man, you're supposed to drink the wine again. Haggadah Yosef says that with regards to the wine, if a man drank it without leaning to his left and he has health concerns, he doesn't have to drink it again, right? But without health concerns, a man is obligated to drink the wine again, or any one of the 4 cups, if he forgot to lean to the left while drinking it. So we said Mageed Ruhsa basically is washing your hands as if you would for bread with the beracha this time. And then we get up to Motsimatsa. So Motsimatsa is when you take, the head of the household takes all 3 matzot in his hands, right? It's the broken matzah in between the 2 whole matzot. And he recites the beracha of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. After he finishes the berakah hamotzi lechem min haaretz, he puts the bottom matzah down. And while holding the top matzah and the broken middle matzah, he recites the berakah of al achilat matzah. And at this point, he breaks off a little bit of the top one, a little bit of the broken one. He dips it in salt and he tastes it. And when he tastes it, he does not have to recline to the left yet, right? First, he's going to distribute a little bit of the top piece and a little bit of the broken middle piece to each member sitting around the table so that they all get a little bit of the matzah that the berakot were recited upon. And then after everyone gets that, then each person is going to recline to the left and eat the required portion of matzah. So the question in the poskim is, how much matzah do you have to eat when you're practicing Motsimatsa, when you've heard the berachot of hamotzi and alachilat matzah? So Hakadosh Yosef's opinion is that if you're going to eat your required portion from the matzah that was on the plate, on the Haggadah plate, so you should have an ounce from the top matzah and an ounce from the bottom matzah, meaning the middle matzah, for a total of 2 ounces. Now, in most cases, especially if you're not using the soft matzah, if you're using the round, crunchy matzah, you're not going to have enough matzah on the plate for even one person to have 2 ounces, because after you broke the middle matzah, most of it was put away for Afikomin, and even the top matzah has now been distributed to everybody around the table. So in most cases, everybody is eating their required matzah portion from the matzah box. And in that case, Hakadosh Yosef says that it's sufficient to eat 1 ounce of matzah from Motsimatsa. If you're not eating the matzah off the middle plate, off the Haggadah plate, it's not necessary to have 2 ounces of matzah from Motsimatsa. Now, if you didn't lean to the left when you ate matzah, for this matzah, the first portion after alachalat matzah, so that's critical, right? Women never have to eat again. If a woman ate matzah without leaning to the left, she's exempt from eating it again. But in this case, if a man did not lean to the left when he ate the matzah for Motsimatsa, he must eat his required portion again. So that's Motsimatsa. Now we get to Maror. So Maror, our custom, the Syrian custom, and many Middle Eastern communities have this custom. When we set up the Haggadah plate, we set up the Haggadah plate based on the opinion of the Arizal. He was the 16th century master of Kabbalah. So the 3 matzot go on the top of the plate. On the upper right, you have the zeroah, the roasted shank bone. Under the zeroah on the right side is the haroset. On the left side, on the top, you have the egg. Under the egg is the celery. And then in the middle section, it says maror. And the bottom middle section says hazeret. Right? So hazeret is a type of maror. Right? It's the romaine lettuce. And romaine lettuce is our tradition for hazeret. Romaine lettuce is actually a very ancient Egyptian lettuce. It got passed down to us through the Greeks and the Romans. And Ashkenazim also have the tradition that hazeret is romaine lettuce. So some put the romaine lettuce at the bottom of the plate where it says hazeret because that's the type of maror that it is. Others say no, since it's the main lettuce, the romaine lettuce is the main maror, it goes in the middle of the plate. So each family can follow their custom. And halab, some people put it in the middle of the plate, some people put it at the bottom, and wherever you put it, the other lettuce, right? It's customary to have another lettuce. The original traditional second lettuce in the Syrian community was escarole. In recent times, let's say the last 20 or 30 years, many people replaced it with the endives. The endives is actually a more modern variety of an ancient lettuce, right? It was developed in Europe in the 19th century. According to Harambam, escarole is tamcha. That's one of the options offered in the Mishnah. So whatever you're going to use, make sure that you clean it well, that you check it well. If you're not sure how to do it, Star K has a website with instructions of how to make sure all of your lettuce is clean and kosher for the night of Pesach. So when you say the berakah ala achilat maror, right? So you're going to take an ounce of lettuce, and again, there's various customs. Some use the romaine lettuce, right? Maran Shulchan Aruch says that the main lettuce, the best way to fulfill your obligation is with romaine lettuce, but not everybody follows Maran's opinion in this case. Some take the other lettuce. They'll take the escarole and make ala achilat maror on the escarole. We find that many Syrian rabbis recorded the custom of taking two of them together, right? As long as between the two of them, they add up to an ounce, right? So whatever your custom is, they're all documented, just the romaine, just the escarole, the romaine and escarole together. Prior to eating it, you dip it in haroset, and then you shake the haroset off. And when you eat the maror, after reciting the berakah ala achilat maror, you don't lean to the left. If someone leaned, he doesn't have to eat it again. But to begin with, it's not appropriate to lean for the maror, right? So now, haroset is also an integral part of the mitzvah. It's a mitzvah in and of itself. The haroset is a memory of the cement that we were forced to work with in slavery. So that's why it goes with the maror. The maror is to remember the bitterness of the slavery, and we have it with the haroset. So Hakam Odia writes that if you didn't have maror, or you couldn't have maror, you still have to have haroset, right? Don't lose the mitzvah of haroset just because you're not able to fulfill the mitzvah of maror. So you could take another vegetable and dip it in the maror, or take a piece of matzah. You could take another vegetable and dip it in the haroset, or a piece of matzah and dip it in the haroset. Or if you couldn't even do that, eat the haroset by itself in order to fulfill the mitzvah of haroset. So after you had matzah by itself, you had maror by itself, we get up to korech. So korech is to take another ounce of matzah and another ounce of maror. Here, the Syrian custom is clear. We mix the two lettuces together in the sandwich. We dip the sandwich in haroset, and we don't shake it off, right? Not necessary to shake it off. And again, eat the sandwich while reclining to the left. So now, since we already fulfilled our obligation of matzah by itself and maror by itself, if someone finds the korech difficult, there are different leniencies with the korech. For instance, you could take, instead of a whole ounce of matzah and a whole ounce of maror, you can be lenient and take 2/3 of an ounce of matzah and 2/3 of an ounce of maror, or even a smaller piece if you're not able to eat any specific amount. In fact, Hakam Yosef says that somebody that finds eating the korech sandwich very difficult, he's not obligated to eat it at all. It's zecher be'alma. It's something that's in memory. If you already fulfilled your obligation with matzah by itself and maror by itself, and you find it exceedingly difficult to have the sandwich, you may be lenient. And likewise, if you ate the sandwich and you failed to lean to the left, and you find it difficult to eat it again, you can be lenient and refrain from eating it again. So that's korech. And now you get up to the meal, right? Shohan orech. Our custom is to eat a piece of the roasted shank bone. Some families, some Halabi families say zecher the korban pesach before eating it, meaning to emphasize that it's just in memory of the korban. It's not the actual korban, of course. Others don't say anything at all, so as not to give people the idea that it might be in place of the korban. Each family follows its custom with regards to that. Interestingly, even though many families developed the custom to boil the shank bone before roasting it, if you look in the original sources from our Halabi rabbis from the 19th century, from the early 20th century, it's clear from their writings that there is no obligation to roast it, to boil it first. They just roasted it. They ate it roasted. Likewise, like other communities, there are other communities that don't serve roasted meats at all on the nights of Pesach, right? Even if they're serving chicken or roast or other types of meats, they make sure everything is boiled, or if you're roasting in the oven, they put it in a lot of gravy. This is not our custom. We could have roasted meats, and we could even have the roasted shank bone. So now, before the meal is completely over, you're obligated to eat more matzah for Afikomin, right? So the requirement, according to Maran Shulchan Aruch, is 1 ounce of matzah. Some, based on later authorities, have the custom to eat 2 ounces of matzah. This is not the requirement. If one wants to be stringent upon himself, he may be, but it's certainly not a requirement in any way. You perfectly fulfill your obligation with 1 ounce of matzah for the Afikomin, and you eat it while reclining to the left. If you forgot to recline to the left, and you already said Birkat HaMazon when you realize that, so you don't eat it again. But if you realize before you made Birkat HaMazon, if you could eat it again, we're talking about men, women never have to eat again or drink again if they didn't recline to the left. But if a man forgot to lean to the left and he didn't make Birkat HaMazon yet, and it wouldn't be too difficult to eat it again, he should. But if he would find it difficult to eat again, like the Korech, he could be lenient and not eat it again because of a failure to lean. But it's not like the Korech where you could skip it. You must have 1 ounce of matzah for Afikomin. And after you finish the Afikomin, you can't eat anything else, right? Drinks are permissible if it's water or coffee or tea. And Chaim says you could sweeten the tea or the coffee with some sugar, right? You could do this before Birkat HaMazon. You could have the coffee or tea or the water after Birkat HaMazon, between the 3rd and 4th cup, all the more so after the 4th cup, all the more so after halachic midnight at 101, right? Now let's say you had something, you had some dessert after Afikomin, you forgot, you took some fruit or some candy. If you hadn't made Birkat HaMazon yet, you're obligated to take another ounce of matzah for Afikomin and eat it. If you already made a Birkat HaMazon, so now you don't go back and eat Afikomin again. But if you didn't eat Afikomin at all, you forgot to eat it, and you made Birkat HaMazon, right? If you didn't have the 3rd cup yet, you go, you wash your hands, and you have 1 ounce of matzah for Afikomin. If you already drank the 3rd cup, when you realize that you didn't have Afikomin at all, so now it depends. If you had 1 ounce of matzah shimura during the meal, right? So you can consider that your Afikomin. But if you didn't have any matzah during the meal, or you had matzah, it was regular matzah, it wasn't the matzah shimura, so even though you had the 3rd cup already, you're still obligated to wash again, say hamotzi, eat your ounce of Afikomin, you make Birkat HaMazon again, but without a cup, right? You already made the first Birkat HaMazon on a cup, you already had your 3rd cup, so you don't have to have another cup. And then after Birkat HaMazon, you have Hallel. As we said, Hallel preferably should be completed by 1:01 a.m. But if you didn't, you still make the beracha, you still drink the wine, you still fulfill your obligation. And the last part of the Haggadah is Nirtzah. That's most have the custom to sing, right? Minyat Lamu Minyatri is a famous Arabic song. It's a Had Miyodea in Arabic. We sing Haggadah, we sing other Pizmonim for Pesach, and Maran and Shulchan Aruch says that beyond that, you're still obligated to continue after you finish singing until you fall asleep. Continue either by learning the laws of Pesach, or talking about the story of Egypt, or reading commentaries until the sleep grabs you. And that's all the halachot and minhagim of Haggadah Shel Pesach. Jack, should I take questions or should we conclude? It's up to you.
I think we can take a few questions. I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
And then if anybody else wants to unmute themselves, you can ask. Do we have where did the idea of the soft matzah versus the hard matzah come from? What's the proper custom that they did?
Matzah, if you go back in history, matzah was always thick, right? According to Maran, as long as the matzah is less than 3 ounces, less than 3 inches thick, it's considered kasher. In Yemenite countries, it was always Yemenite community was always thick. And then over the years, it started really more in European countries, but did spread to the Middle East as well. They would make it thinner and thinner. And why did they want to make it so thin? Because based on the concept that if matzah is not fully baked, so now it's raw past the 18-minute limitation. So even though I took it out of the oven and put it in the box, if it wasn't fully baked, it's turning into hametz, so to speak. So in order to avoid any doubt, they made it thinner and thinner so that it would get fully baked during the baking process, and they wouldn't worry about it. But there are the soft matzah is still available. It's 100% kasher. It's made under very good supervision, and people like it better because it's soft. So it's really hamotzi, right? It's not just hamotzi just because it's Pesach. It could be hamotzi anyway. I've been using the soft for, I don't know, the last 20 years or so, and I like it much better.
Morris, can you give us any tips on using the soft one? Because it does become hard if you don't put it back in the freezer. Is there any way of keeping it soft?
You take it out when you're ready to use it. You could even heat it a little bit with the oven, and as soon as you're done, put it back in the freezer.
Uh-huh.
Somebody sent a message that I forgot to mention eating the egg. That's true. Before we eat the shank bone, the roasted shank bone, it's customary to take the egg, dip it in salt, and say Zecher the Korban Hagigah, and we eat the egg. That's also a custom that we always practice.
I'll tell you a custom that my father told me from his father, alav shalom.
Yeah.
When we eat the egg, he would say, Targum betza be'a chutz hachamana alana u'ba'el lemifrak yatana migugaluta.
Very nice. First time I'm hearing it. There's different customs associated with eating the egg. I know some people have the custom that when they take out the Haggadah plate during the 4 questions, that a single girl takes it inside and she eats the egg from the plate. That's not our custom, but I know I've heard of people that have that custom. We wait until after korech, right? Before we eat the shank bone, we eat an egg.
Asked how much is 1 ounce in the soft matzah? Oh, in the round matzah and the soft matzah, Nathan Terzi.
How much is an ounce? So when you
The hard matzah.
right, so with the round crunchy matzah, usually I think each round one is usually approximately 2 ounces, right? That's in weight, right? Rabbi Feinstein estimated that the volume is 2/3 of that. So that means 2/3 of a round matzah is 2 ounces based on that estimate. If you're not sure, you could weigh it as long as you have a mechanical scale. You could even weigh it on the night of Pesach, even when Pesach next year it's going to fall on Friday night, even if it's Friday night. Maran writes that you're allowed to weigh things for a purpose of a mitzvah, right? There's a purpose of a mitzvah. As long as it's not an electric scale, if it's a mechanical, like a food scale, you can weigh it to be sure. The soft matzah is much heavier, right? So each round matzah could be 4 or 5 ounces in weight, but they do say that you should have a little bit more than an ounce in weight because it's so dense. So people have like a 1 1/3 or 1 1/2 of the soft matzah in order to have an ounce in volume. Somebody asked, I think, a question about pouring the wine at when we say the Eser Makot. So we pour 16 drops of wine. First we say pour 1 for dam, va'esh, v'timirot ashan. Then we pour 10 more for the 10 plagues, and then we pour 3 more when we say the acronym of Rabbi Yehuda, the Tzach Hadash Be'achab. This custom originated as an Ashkenazic custom in Germany in the 13th century. It became adopted by Sephardim because the Kabbalistic rabbis promoted the custom, they endorsed the custom, and Sephardim picked it up from that time. Someone asked a question, can we just boil the shank? So Maran and Shulchan Aruch says that it should be roasted, right? But he doesn't require eating it. It's customary to have something roasted in memory of the Korban Pesach because the Korban Pesach was roasted. So you want to do something that was as close as possible. Those Sephardim that don't eat roasted just don't eat it, right? There are some Ashkenazic authorities. This is where boiling came from. There are some Ashkenazic authorities that require eating the shank bone. Maran didn't rule like them. Our custom is you're not required to eat it. It's just optional. But since there was some Ashkenazic authorities that required eating it, but they don't eat any roasted meats in their countries, right? This is based on the Mishnah that says a place that has the custom not to eat roasted meats doesn't eat roasted meats. So they were those places, they didn't eat roasted meats, but they wanted to eat the shank bone. They required it. So they innovated the custom of boiling it. But we don't have any prohibition of eating roasted meats. We're a place that has the custom to eat roasted meats, and we don't require you eating it. So it would never occur to us to have to boil the shank bone. So we would roast it And those countries, those Middle Eastern countries that eat roasted meats like us, like Halab and Egypt, eat it. And those countries like Turkey and Baghdad that they don't eat roasted meats, they leave it on the plate. They eat it in the day. Some eat it on the first day. Some eat it on the second day only. Some wait till Hala Mu'ed to eat it. Each country and city according to its custom.
Thank you, Morris. I think,
Okay.
we'll call it a night. One second, wait one more.
One.
Is it one, just last question, can you boil the shank and not roast it?
Right, I was just answering that Maran says that it should be roasted because it's in memory of the korban, which was roasted, and then in the Sephardic communities, if you ate roasted meats, then you could eat it if you want. If you don't eat roasted meats, then you couldn't eat it until it was your custom to eat roasted meats. There was some ate it in the day, some only ate it on the second day, some waited till Hala Mu'ed, but it was never our custom to boil it.
But if you boil it first and then roast it according to everyone, then you could probably eat it.
So when you say according to everyone, so I'm talking about according to the Syrian rabbis, there was never a concept of boiling it, right? It's a recent custom that developed, but it's not documented as a requirement.
Understood. Okay. Morris, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, the school report and more.
Have a great night, everyone. Bye-bye.
You too.